Every ending is a beautiful neon requiem, a glowing tribute to the path we've walked and the lessons we've learned. Join us as we close this chapter and prepare for the next big reveal. Hit subscribe now and witness the beauty of a perfect resolution.
The night my sister told me to get out, she was wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of Pinot Grigio. It was 11:47 p.m. I remember because I looked at the microwave clock when she said it, the way you do when your brain is trying to hold on to something real while everything else is falling apart. "You need to find somewhere else to be," she said, not yelling. That was the worst part. She said it the way you'd tell someone the dishwasher was full, flat, final. Like she'd thought about it for a long time and the thinking was already over. I was standing in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, the house where I learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I'd cried into a pillow the night my dad died, where my mom had kept a growth chart penciled into the doorframe of the pantry, mine and my sister's heights every birthday until we were 17. The house was mine now. Half mine. That's what the will said, but my sister had gotten there first. Let me go back. My mother passed in March, fast. Pancreatic cancer, which is a sentence that doesn't leave room for preparation. She was diagnosed in January and gone by the time the azaleas bloomed. I was living in Cincinnati at the time, working as a paralegal at a mid-size firm, sharing an apartment with a roommate who kept strange hours. When my mom got the diagnosis, I gave notice at work, broke my lease, and moved back home to Roanoke to take care of her. My sister. I'll call her by what she was to me at the time, which is my older sister, 4 years ahead of me, always 4 years ahead. She flew in for the diagnosis appointment and then flew back to her life in Scottsdale. She had a husband, 2 kids in private school, a house with a pool, and what she described as a lot of moving parts that made it hard to be away. She sent meal delivery subscriptions. She FaceTimed our mom on Sundays. She was present the way a postcard is present, technically accounted for, nothing you can actually hold. I was the one who drove to the oncology appointments. I was the one who learned the difference between palliative and curative, who filled the weekly pill organizer, who sat on the edge of my mother's bed at 2 a.m. when the pain medication wasn't working and she couldn't sleep and she wanted to talk about my dad. I was the one who was there. I don't say that to make myself a martyr. I say it because it matters to what happened later. My mother's estate was straightforward on paper. The house in Roanoke, split equally between us. A small savings account. Personal belongings. And then there was the property on Guthrie Mill Road, a piece of land about 40 minutes outside of town that had belonged to my grandfather. There was an old building on it, some kind of workshop or storage structure he'd used for his landscaping business decades ago. My mother had been paying the property taxes on it every year for as long as I could remember, but no one had been out there in years. My grandfather had died when I was 12. The building had been locked up and forgotten. My sister got the house. That was her choice, offered before the estate was even formally settled, in a phone call that lasted less than 10 minutes. "I want to buy out your half of the house," she said. "I'll have it appraised, you'll get fair market value for your share, and then you can use that to get yourself set up somewhere." I should have had a lawyer. I know that now. But I was 31 years old. I had just watched my mother take her last breath 3 weeks earlier, and my sister spoke with the calm certainty of someone who has never once doubted that the world will arrange itself according to her preferences. The appraisal came in, my share came to a little under $60,000, and I signed the paperwork at the kitchen table while my sister made coffee and talked about the renovations she was planning. What I got, besides the money, was the Guthrie Mill Road property. Neither of us wanted it. It wasn't discussed as anything other than a formality. My sister said, "That land is basically worthless. There's nothing on it but a falling down shed, but it's yours if you want it." I said sure. I wasn't thinking about the land. I was thinking about where I was going to sleep that night and the night after, because I had no apartment, no job lined up, and $60,000 that would disappear fast if I wasn't careful. My sister had said I could stay in the house while I figured things out. She said this in front of the estate attorney, which felt like something that meant it was real. It meant nothing. I stayed for 6 weeks. I kept to myself, slept in my old room, tried to be invisible while also applying for jobs and looking at rental listings and fielding calls from the storage unit company, where I'd put everything I owned from Cincinnati. My sister arrived in late May with her husband and both kids, and a plan that apparently included converting my childhood bedroom into a guest room before the end of the month. She didn't tell me this until her husband was already pulling the old dresser away from the wall. That's when she told me to get out. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the microwave clock and felt something happen in my chest. Not quite rage. Not quite rage. Something quieter and colder than either of those things. Like a door shutting. "I'll be out by the weekend," I said. "I was thinking tomorrow would be better," she said. I went upstairs and I packed 2 bags. I left everything else in the room because I didn't know what else to do with it. On my way to the kitchen, I took the folder of property documents off the counter. The deed to the Guthrie Mill Road parcel, the tax records going back 15 years, a hand-drawn map my grandfather had apparently made of the plot. I don't know why I took it. Habit, maybe. I'd spent enough time handling paperwork in the last year, the grabbing documents felt like instinct. I sat in my car in the driveway for a while. I had $60,000 in a savings account and 2 bags and nowhere to be. It was almost midnight and I was in Roanoke, Virginia, which is not a city full of options at midnight. I thought about motels. I thought about calling a friend, but my friends were in Cincinnati and this was not the kind of thing I wanted to explain over the phone. I thought about the property on Guthrie Mill Road. I don't know what I was expecting. I think part of me just wanted somewhere to go that belonged to me, even if it was a piece of land with a falling down shed. My sister had called it worthless. The estate attorney hadn't even mentioned it without a vague gesture that communicated it was being included for the sake of completeness. I was operating on fumes and I just wanted to go somewhere that was mine. The drive took 43 minutes. It was almost 1 a.m. by the time I turned off the paved road and onto the gravel track my grandfather's map described. The headlights caught the edge of a structure, bigger than I'd imagined when someone said old shed. Much bigger. My grandfather's landscaping operation must have been more substantial than I'd understood as a child. The building was maybe 8,000 square feet. Metal roof, cinder block walls, 2 large rolling doors on the front, a standard door on the side. The kind of structure you'd use to store equipment. Serious equipment. It was dark and the weeds had grown up around the base of the walls and one of the rain gutters had pulled away from the roofline, but the bones of it were solid. I could see that even by headlights. I used the key from the folder. The side door opened. Inside it was dark and closed and smelled like oil and old wood and something metallic I couldn't name. I found a light switch and got one of the overhead fluorescents to flicker on. Half the fixtures were dead, but enough worked that I could see. The main floor was mostly open space. Concrete, a little cracked. Some old shelving units along one wall, a few plastic bins stacked in a corner, a workbench with tools that had been there long enough to rust at the edges. I was looking at a place where someone had once run a business and then slowly stopped. Nothing remarkable. I started to feel foolish for driving out here at 1 a.m. Then I noticed the back wall. It wasn't quite right. That's the only way I know how to describe it. The building was a rectangle, and the proportions of the interior didn't match the exterior. There was maybe 15-20 feet unaccounted for. The back wall was drywall, smooth, painted over, same cream color as the rest. But the rest of the walls were cinder block. I walked over and knocked on it, hollow. I am my mother's daughter. My mother was the kind of woman who, when she noticed something was off, did not let it go until she understood it. She wasn't suspicious by nature, she was just thorough. That trait skipped my sister entirely. It landed in me. I found a utility knife in a toolbox on the workbench. I scored the drywall along the edge, where it met the floor, where it met the sidewall. I found the seam where a door had been cut and then covered over. The drywall panel came away in sections, leaving a fine, white dust on my clothes and in my hair. Behind it was a room. Not a small room. Not a closet. A room that ran the full width of the building and went back about 18 feet, with its own lighting, dead bulbs. But the fixtures were there, and a concrete floor that was cleaner than the main space. Cleaner in the way that something had been stored there carefully, intentionally, by someone who cared about what was inside. There were 4 of them. 4 cars, covered in fitted fabric covers, each one in what appeared to be a separate climate-controlled enclosure created by a secondary wall of heavy plastic sheeting. A dehumidifier, long dead, unplugged, sat in the corner. There were maintenance logs on a clipboard hanging near the door. The most recent entry was dated 11 years ago, which was a few months after my grandfather died. I lifted the corner of the nearest cover. I am not a car person. I want to be clear about that. I grew up in a house where we drove Hondas until the wheels fell off. I had no framework for what I was looking at beyond old and very shiny, and someone kept this thing incredibly clean. I took pictures on my phone of every car, every angle, every detail I could see. I photographed the maintenance logs. I photographed the VIN plates. I photographed the license plates, which were still on the cars, which were vintage Virginia plates, which told me absolutely nothing but which felt important to document. I slept on the back seat of one of them that night. I didn't know what else to do. It was the most comfortable car I had ever been inside, and I want to be precise about that detail. I slept in the back seat of a car I didn't yet know the value of, on the worst night of my adult life, and it was genuinely comfortable. That detail would matter later. In the morning, I drove to a diner in town and used their Wi-Fi and started searching VIN numbers. The first one came back as a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. I Googled that. I sat very still for a moment. The second one was a 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible. I had to Google what that meant. Then I had to put my phone down and drink some water. The third was a 1967 Shelby GT500. The fourth was a 1971 De Tomaso Pantera, which I had never heard of, which turned out to not matter because it was apparently extraordinarily rare in this configuration. I am a paralegal. I was a paralegal. I know how to research. I know how to find information methodically and build a picture from documented facts and not get ahead of myself before the picture is complete. That training is the only reason I didn't fall apart in that diner. I made a list. I wrote down everything I knew and everything I needed to find out and what I needed to do in what order. Step 1 was getting an independent appraisal. Not from someone local. Not from someone who might know my family or my sister's husband or anyone connected to anything. I needed a specialist. I found an automotive historian in Richmond who specialized in pre-1975 American muscle and European performance cars. His name was not a name I'll share because I don't have his permission, but he had a CV that included work with major auction houses and several published books on collector vehicles. I emailed him that night from the diner parking lot. I attached photos. I told him I was trying to understand what I'd found. He called me the next morning. His voice was measured, but I could hear something careful in it, the way someone talks when they're trying not to sound as excited as they are. He drove out 2 days later. He spent 4 hours in that building. He went through the maintenance logs page by page. He examined each car from every angle, checked the engine stamps, verified the VINs. He brought a colleague with him on the second visit. They spoke to each other in what I can only describe as the technical language of people who love something very much and want to be precise about it. When he sat down with me at the workbench to give his assessment, he folded his hands and looked at me for a moment before he spoke. "Where did you say your grandfather's business was based?" he asked. I told him. "Small operation," I said. "Local landscaping." He nodded slowly. "These cars were purchased in the late 60s and early 70s, he said. Low mileage, meticulously maintained for about 20 years, then stored properly. Your grandfather knew what he had, he just never told anyone. The appraisal took 3 weeks. It came back in writing, stamped, signed, with comparable sale records attached. The Camaro ZL1, $850,000 to $1.1 million in current market. The Hemi Cuda convertible, $2.8 to $3.4 million. The Shelby GT500, $400,000 to $550,000. The De Tomaso Pantera in this configuration, $280,000 to $320,000 to $320,000. Total estimated value 0.4.3 to 5.4 million. The Cuda alone, he noted, would likely perform above estimate at the right auction. I read that document 4 times in a row. I went outside and stood in the weeds next to the building and looked at the metal roof in the afternoon sun. I thought about my mother, who had paid the property taxes on this land every year without ever coming out here. I thought about my grandfather, who had apparently been quietly building something his whole life, and then just locked the door and never told a soul. I thought about my sister, pouring herself a second glass of Pinot Grigio while I carried 2 bags out to my car. I did not call her. I called a different attorney. Not the estate attorney, who I no longer felt entirely neutral about. A property attorney in Richmond who had no connection to my family. I drove up and sat in her office and laid the deed and the appraisal report on her desk. The property had transferred to me cleanly. It was in my name. There were no liens, no competing claims. My grandfather had owned it outright and it had passed through my mother's estate without any dispute because no one had considered it worth disputing. My sister had said it was worthless, and she had meant it. And she had been, by any reasonable measure, absolutely wrong. The cars are on property you own, the attorney said. The cars were stored there, presumably with your grandfather's knowledge and consent, and he's been gone for over a decade. Under the circumstances, you have a very solid claim to the vehicles as contents of your property. She recommended I not contact my sister until after I'd made decisions about what to do with the cars. That recommendation was easy to follow. I called the appraiser back and asked about auction options. He mentioned a few houses. He mentioned one in particular based out of New York that had handled 3 major American muscle car sales in the last 18 months. He made a call on my behalf. I flew up 2 weeks later and sat across from a woman who wore minimal jewelry and spoke about cars the way surgeons speak about procedures, with absolute precision and zero sentimentality. She told me the Cuda alone, with proper marketing and the right sale, could see $3.5 to $4 million. She told me the collection, offered together with a well-documented provenance story, would generate significant collector interest. She told me she wanted to take it. I signed the consignment agreement in her office. The cars were transported by a specialized carrier, insured for transport, climate-controlled trucks, a 3-person team who treated each vehicle with the kind of care that made me feel like I'd been entirely right to trust the process. The sale was scheduled for 4 months out. I found a short-term rental in Roanoke, a small apartment near downtown, and I waited. I kept working. I picked up remote paralegal work to cover expenses, and I talked to no one about any of it except my attorney and, eventually, a financial advisor she recommended. I was building something and I did not want anyone to knock it over before it was finished. My sister called twice during those months. Once to ask if I'd gotten settled. Once to tell me that she and her husband were thinking of doing a kitchen renovation and were wondering if I'd taken any of Mom's cookware because they couldn't find a particular Dutch oven. I said I hadn't taken it. I didn't ask how the guest room was coming along. The auction was in October. I flew up the night before and sat in the back of the sale room in a chair next to my attorney who had flown up with me because that's the kind of attorney she was. The Cuda sold for $4.1 million. The Camaro went for $980,000. The Shelby went for $510,000. The Pantera went for $340,000. Total, after the auction house commission, approximately $5.1 million. I did not cry in the sale room. I cried later in a hotel sitting on the floor next to the bed, because I was thinking about my grandfather building his little landscaping company and buying these cars one at a time and covering them so carefully and keeping the logs so neatly, and then dying before he could tell anyone what he'd quietly put away. I cried because my mother had paid those property taxes for 12 years without knowing what she was holding. I cried because I had slept in the back of a $4 million car on the worst night of my life, and it had held me. My financial advisor was very good. We talked about the money carefully and over several sessions before I touched any significant portion of it. I set aside a portion for taxes. I invested the bulk of it. I used a piece of it to purchase a small stake in a property company that a friend of my attorney's was expanding. Not because I knew real estate, but because I had spent the last several months learning that property is the kind of thing worth understanding. I also bought an apartment. Not in Roanoke, in a city I'd always wanted to try. I paid cash. My sister found out the way people find out things they didn't expect, in pieces, from the wrong direction, too late to do anything about it. Her husband, apparently, followed auction results. Not obsessively, but enough that when a notable American muscle car sale came across an industry newsletter he subscribed to, a sale that included a 1970 Hemi Cuda with a Virginia provenance and an estate story, he made a connection. He mentioned it to my sister. My sister looked up the sale. She recognized my grandfather's name in the provenance documentation, which the auction house had included because it added to the story. She called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my new city, sitting in the kitchen of my new apartment, eating lunch. Those cars, she said. No preamble. No hello, grandfather's cars. They were in that building on Guthrie Mill Road. Yes, I said. And you sold them? Yes. There was a pause. Long enough that I could hear her breathing. Those were family assets, she said. They should have been part of the estate. The property was part of the estate, I said. It was assessed. It was included. I received it. What was on the property was mine. You knew. Her voice changed. When you took that property, you knew. I didn't know anything when I took the property, I said, which was true. I found out later. I had them independently appraised and I made decisions about my own assets. You're welcome to discuss it with my attorney if you have questions about the legal standing. She hung up. Her husband called the next day with a different energy. Less shock, more calculation. He mentioned what a reasonable family would do and equitable distribution and how this would look. I gave him my attorney's contact information and told him I wished them well. They sent a letter through a lawyer. My attorney responded. The legal reality was clear. The property transferred cleanly. The contents of my property were mine. My grandfather's vehicles had not been listed or disclosed in the estate because no one, including my mother, had apparently known they were there in the form they were in. There was no case. Not a real one. They did not pursue it. I heard through my mother's cousin, who sends me a Christmas card every year and has a granddaughter who goes to school with my sister's older kid, that my sister's husband had made some significant investment decisions in the last couple of years that hadn't gone the way he'd planned, that the Scottsdale house had been refinanced, that private school tuition was being discussed in terms I gathered were stressful. I don't feel good about that, exactly. But I don't feel bad about it either. I feel the way I feel about weather. What I feel good about, what I feel when I think about it clearly, is the night I sat in my car at the end of my grandfather's gravel drive and decided to use the key. I feel good about standing in that dim fluorescent light and noticing that the back wall wasn't right. I feel good about taking pictures of every VIN number at 2 a.m. with my phone propped against a fender. I feel good about calling a specialist in Richmond and not someone local. I feel good about the attorney in her office, and the agreement I signed, and the woman in New York who spoke about cars like surgeries. I feel good about the fact that I did not call my sister. Not once, in all those months, did I pick up the phone and say, "You'll never believe what I found." I knew, somewhere underneath the grief and the exhaustion and the particular fury of being handed 2 bags and shown the door, that the time for sharing things with her had passed. My grandfather had a saying. My mother told me once. I don't know when he said it or why she remembered it, but she did, and she passed it to me. A door you lock yourself can only be opened by someone who finds the key. He had locked that room. He had taken the key with him. 12 years later, in the middle of the worst night of my life, I was the one standing at the door. I found the key. I walked inside. Everything that happened after that was just what happens when you pay attention and don't give up and refuse. Even when someone in a silk robe tells you to leave, to stop believing that what belongs to you is worth fighting for. People ask me sometimes, not many people, because I haven't told many people, whether I feel guilty about how it all turned out, whether I feel like I should have called my sister sooner, whether the right thing would have been to split it somehow, to be generous, to be the bigger person. I've thought about that a lot. I mean, really sat with it, not just dismissed it. Here's where I land. I am not the reason my sister has the life she has. She built that herself, choice by choice, starting long before our mother got sick. She chose to stay in Scottsdale while I drove to oncology appointments. She chose to speak about the estate like a transaction to be managed rather than a loss to be shared. She chose to hand me a property she'd written off as worthless and tell me to be grateful for it. She made every one of those decisions freely, and they were the decisions of someone who had calculated over and over that I was worth less than she was, that my time, my grief, my presence, all of it was worth less. What she didn't calculate was that I might pay attention, that I might notice when a wall doesn't add up, that I might, at 1 a.m, with nothing left to lose, decide to find out why. I think about my grandfather a lot now. I never really knew him. He died when I was 12, and he was the kind of man who didn't explain himself much. But he bought those cars one at a time over years, and he covered them carefully, and he kept the maintenance logs, and then he locked the door. He wasn't hiding them from anyone in particular. I think he just understood something that took me longer to learn, that the things you tend quietly, without announcing them, are often the things that last. My mother tended that property the same way. She paid the taxes every year without complaint, without knowing what was behind that wall, just because it had been her father's, and that was reason enough. She passed it to me the same way, not because it was valuable, but because she trusted me to take care of what needed taking care of. She did that her whole life. I just didn't see it clearly until she was gone. That's the thing about losing someone. You stop seeing them as just your parent, your person, and you start seeing the shape of the whole life they lived. My mother was careful and thorough, and she never walked away from a responsibility because it was inconvenient. I learned that from watching her. I didn't always know I was learning it. What happened to me in that building wasn't luck. I want to be clear about that. Luck is finding a 20 on the sidewalk. What happened was the result of a lot of small decisions made correctly under pressure. Going back to the property instead of a motel, noticing the wall, taking pictures of every VIN at 2 a.m., calling the right specialist, hiring the right attorney, keeping my mouth shut for 8 months while I built something solid. None of that is luck. That is what happens when you take the thing you were handed, even the thing everyone said was worthless, and you treat it like it might matter. My sister treated me like I didn't matter. For years. I kept showing up anyway, kept doing the work, kept paying attention. I'm not saying I was patient because I'm virtuous. I'm saying I did it because it was right and because I didn't know another way to be. That's what my mother modeled. That's what my grandfather modeled in his quiet way, with his careful logs and his locked door. What you tend, tends you back. Not always. Not on a schedule. But often enough that it's worth paying attention to what you're actually building, even when no one is watching, even when the person you trusted most is pouring herself a glass of wine and telling you to leave. I found the key. I walked in. That's the whole story, really. Everything else was just what happened next.